This is September 19th, 1994. This is the River Runners Oral History Project. And we're down here at wherever it is, what is it, 191. And we're talking to Brad Dimock. That's D-I-M-O-C-K. For you, Barb. And what I've been asking all these guys, let's just, for starters, what we need is just kind of a quick resume of how'd you connect with the Grand Canyon, and just a sort of an overview of your career here.
Let's see, I fled from upstate New York, where I was born and raised, after high school, looking for a college as far away from New York as I could find, and found one of these kind of hippie type schools out in Prescott, Arizona, Prescott College. And they accepted me, and I went out there, and the first thing I did out there, they would take a group of students, take them out in the wilderness for a couple weeks, kind of outward boundy sort of a deal, and they brought me down here. And that was pretty fun. We had a motor rig and a couple of paddle boats, one paddle boat. But by day two, the people who were in the paddle boat on day one had become the paddle boat crew, so I was on the motor rig. That got me interested in geology, but not really in river running as a career. I didn't think that I was cut out for that. Then the next year, we did another one, paddle boat trip, and a friend of mine asked me along, day dealer hunt. And we paddled through in November, and I started thinking it was pretty cool, the boating thing, and thought maybe I'd try and get on one of the river companies the next summer. Maybe a motor company needed a helper or something, because again, I didn't really think that I could be a bronze-bodied hero boatman rowing with oars and all that. Maybe I could help.
You mean when you say you weren't cut out for it, you mean you just didn't know you could do it? Or
well, I didn't, I'd never done anything physical in my life. I skipped out in gym class and never did anything physical except play in the sandbox.
You mean in school you weren't like big in sports and all that stuff?
No, I hated PE. Always skipped it. No, I was a real non-physical kind of a person. And all my buddies went and got on the fire crew, so I went and tried out for that and washed out the first afternoon. Just not the right kind of guy.
The fire...
What's that?
The fire crew, you mean you mean forest fire?
Yeah,
fire?
Prescott College had a whole crew, pretty much, in Prescott. Oh, anyhow, I applied to all the motor outfitters, and most of them didn't respond, and a couple of them said no, but Canyoneers, Gaylord Stavely, invited me up to interview. So I went up and interviewed, and Gaylord wasn't there, but I talked to Joan, and I think Pete Lindeman was working there at the time, and they said, sure, you're on. Because I knew a lot of natural history. I'd been studying it all winter for a year and a half at that point. So I started in '73 as an interpretive assistant for Canyoneers, $20 a day. Immediately got a promotion to $25 after my first trip. And swamped for 2 years running the motor rigs. And Cam Stavely and Danny Lindeman taught me how to drive. And on my third year, I was still going to college and doing this in the off season. My third year, I was up there before the first trip, and the boatman didn't show up. And the day before the trip, I asked Gaylord told him if Ed doesn't show, I think I could probably do that. And he said, yeah, I think you could too. So the next day he said, well, you'll be leading this season. So I went from swamper to trip leader, because Cameron wasn't old enough to lead trips. So Cam and I ran a lot together. But I did that for another 3 years and Canyoneers cycled through an awful lot of boatmen because it was such a fast trip. It wasn't very rewarding and a lot of work. So they'd cycle through, and I became their lead guide for the last 2 years I worked there. And then they started a little rowing operation with these big Chubascos, and I had started doing a little rowing on my own with Prescott College, and Gaylord said, I want you to head up the rowing program. And so I swelled with pride, So I was the director of rowing trips at Canyoneers. Did one trip a year. But by the end of '77, he decided that rowing just wasn't where Canyoneers wanted to go, and he shut that program down. And in spring of '77, I'd gotten the opportunity to go and row a trip out for Ken Slight on the low water, and gotten to know their crew. And so in the end of '77, I quit and applied to 3 other companies for a job as a rowing boatman, to Slight, to OARS, and to Martin. And George sent me a letter, said, "Dear Bob, afraid we don't have any room for you," and I still got that. And Ken Slight said, "Consider yourself hired." And Martin didn't say anything until the next spring. I got a letter from Persis that said, "We've got you scheduled for 2 trips in September and October." So I worked for a year for Ken, which was great. Worked everywhere: San Juan, Deso, Cat, Grand Canyon, Lador, and really enjoyed that. Crumbo and I had our little ego wars, but we got along pretty good, really. And then that fall went to work for Dory's, fall of '78, and loved it. And next spring had to tell Ken that I wasn't coming back because they'd offered me a season at Dory's. That was right when Dory's was growing, and they went to a 3rd crew, and they had room. So rode Dory's from '78 on, and kind of fell in with the bad boys. Tim Cooper and Bago and a lot of the newer guys were really pretty tired of the old way, which was pretty standardized camps and standardized runs and a pretty tight grip on outlet of creativity. And we were just too wild and young and crazed to stick with that. So we were the fun and stun crew. Eventually got to the point where I was asked to seek employment elsewhere in 1982. But they took me right back. But I did start freelancing pretty heavily, which was, I think, was real good for me and for Dory's. Because I worked for McCallum a lot, and Wilderness World, and Moki Mac, and probably 1 or 2 others at the time. But still, really, my heart was with Dory's. And when Jane came into managership at Dory's, I was a full-time guide at Dory's again, and one of their main trip leaders. I really enjoyed that last few years at the old company. And then it sold. And I came down to Flagstaff and tried to keep the spirit going, and got in a lot of screaming wars with Mike Walker, and at one point quit. And then that winter Mike quit also, so I came back. And
Mike Walker is the manager, was the manager of the new, of OARS, which was now OARS Grand Canyon Dory's.
Right.
Because Martin Litton sold the company to George Wendt, who owns OARS, to make a lot. That's an oversimplification, but that's what that refers to.
During that whole time, I had, I think starting in the fall of '85, I got involved with Sobek, which is a long story that we don't need to go into here. Involves women. And we ended up going to Chile just on a whim, and got hired as a core crew for the BOBO, which was a tremendous experience for me. Just the type of rowing, and that was, I'd say, when I was at my peak as an oarsman, was probably 87, 88 in there, rowing BOBO all winter and Dory's all summer. That was great. Nowadays, I've quit running the Sobek thing. It was just a little too much for me, and the BOBO program was degrading in a lot of ways. Dam was being built The river was getting crowded. Too many crews running, so we had green crews, and it was more fun running with the old guys. So I quit. And I got married too, and that made me want to stay home more. Now I just do a few Grand Canyon trips and try and keep a program running for dories up in Utah. Yampa, Desolation, Cataract, San Juan, do that every year because it's really neat. I love going up there. And occasionally do a trip elsewhere, Alaska, on the Alsec or Guatemala border on Mexico, the Usumacinta. I keep trying to stay home more and more and end up on the river full time, as the usual retirement story.
What was it about, what struck you, what was it about the dories back in the beginning that drew you to them, and how did they, what was it about them, and what was it about Martin? Or like, how did Martin strike you in the beginning?
The $64,000 question, what was it? It was the boats a lot. The boats, are the initial visual draw, at least for me. When I first saw those boats in probably 73, I just went, my God, look at those. I thought they were so cool that probably they would never speak to me. And they didn't for a while. There was a lot of arrogance. But then my buddy Tim Cooper got on with them, and I'd gotten to know Andre on a trip in 73 on Cataract, and OC I'd met. They actually would talk to me, and they liked me. It amazed me as a Canyoneers boatman, because I just had this feeling of an outcast. And so when I got hired, I came on, and I was just deliriously happy. They gave me the boat I'm still rowing, and I rode that a bunch. But I immediately realized it was a lot more than just the boats. It was the schedule, the 18-day or more schedule, going places, spending time. It was having cooks along, having a big, really senior, really knowledgeable crew almost all the time, because by then, that's what Martin had. I didn't figure out the Martin thing for quite a while. There were a lot of people at Dory's that thought he was pretty well deranged, and he underpaid us and was always trying to cut corners and run 7-boat trips and take away our insurance and give us $100 a year to buy our own and blah, blah, blah. And so there was a bit of resentment of him. And then he'd do these wild things like fill his airplane up with day-old bread at the Oro Wheat store in Palo Alto and fly it to Hurricane to save money. And but as the years went by, I think more and more people picked up on what an amazing guy he was. And especially after it sold and we got a businessman running the company, we realized what Martin really was, which was an incredible idealist with a lot of quirks and contradictions. And I adore the guy. I just think he's so cool. But at the time, and I don't know how many people will admit that, but a lot of the boatmen thought he was perhaps even counterproductive at that point. But I think that's part of being in your 20s and being fairly egocentric, thinking it's you that are making the trip and not who's setting up the parameters you work under.
When you say counterproductive, you mean when it came to running good trips or saving
keeping the company afloat. Because he'd give away whole trips, to a good cause. And he'd slash people's fares if they gave him a good story. And he'd sell all the next year's trips at a great discount rather than go to the bank. And he was always doing this financially scary stuff. But that was Martin. And it took us a while, I think, to realize that what he did was maybe not the smartest way to run a company, but what he built was phenomenal. You don't know what you got till it's gone. When the house of cards came tumbling down when we found out he'd sold it, people were absolutely devastated. I just couldn't believe it had happened. And a lot of us thought, that was the end right there. in fall of '87 that there would be no more anything like we'd ever seen. We've been able to pretty well, I think, preserve the river experience, but it's compromised, I think, more and more each year by business, bringing more and more distractions and shortening the trips and cutting them all up, and the loss of just a home base family feeling that's now pretty industrial. It's been hard. We haven't lost hope.
How about describing your involvement with GCRG, how that came up for you, and your love of publishing and stuff like that? How does all that go together?
Well, Grand Canyon River Guides was one of Kenton Grua's many children. And Kenton and I have butted heads a lot over the years. We often don't agree on much of anything, and sometimes we've been accused of disagreeing with each other just on principle. And Kenton's had some of the all-time great ideas at Dory's that have really made us what we are, and he's also had some kind of wild ones that aggravated a lot of people. So you never knew with Kenton whether it was going to be one of the great ones or one of the bad ones. And I steered pretty well clear of Grand Canyon River Guides for a couple of years. Probably just an ego thing. And I thought it was a waste of time. I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. And Kenton was pretty sure it was going to change the world. But actually, it's pretty much my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, that kind of dragged me in there. She started doing more and more with him, just helping him run it as a business, because you have to do that to make anything work. If your finances collapse, you lose all your credibility and you go down the tubes. And when Tom Moody took over as president, he was on me, not daily, but weekly or bi-weekly. He'd be trying to drag me into it. Come on, Brad, come on. It's okay, come on, we need you. And I think what got me involved with it was when they came out with the National Park Service alcohol policy, which on your first reading maybe it wasn't bad, but if you read it with a federal eye, it meant the Park Service had the ability to end your career for as little as being seen with a beer in your hand during the day. And I got heavily involved overnight with it. And there was another issue that was going at that same time where one of the dory boatmen, Bago, was banished from the canyon for 2 years for shooting off bottle rockets. Actually, they were bigger than bottle rockets. They were full-on Dixie cannons. And GCRG went to war, and all of a sudden I went from not really being involved to being de facto board member. And I started to realize that, geez, this thing really is something. It's going somewhere. And we're getting an ear with the park and with outfitters and everything else. So I immediately got involved with the newsletter as well, which Tom Moody had been pretty much heading up with his little tiny Macintosh. And I'd always loved publishing. I never really got too involved with it, but I always loved it. When I was a little kid, we had these hand crank ditto machines that made those little purple things, and I always liked to hang around those and go. I liked office supply stores. There was just this penchant. And when I was in high school, we three of us had an underground newspaper for a little over about a year. Gintog it was called, which didn't mean anything at all. And we got quite a bit of acclaim in high school for being, we weren't really rabble-rousers, we were sort of more philosophical. And then I didn't do much more with it in college. I got involved with their newspaper for a month or two, but drifted off and did a lot of photography, graphic design, and an awful lot of boating skills and outdoor leadership, and all the sciences that were involved in running a Grand Canyon trip. So when I came to GCRG and they had this newsletter, and Moody just sort of dragged me into it. At the same time, I had kind of taken over a little occasional publication that the Dory Guides did called the Hibernacle News. And I did my first one of those in Flagstaff after the company moved. And I learned how to run a Macintosh. And pretty much took it over from Moody. And then we got a bigger Macintosh, and I got a bigger program, and I just kept learning and editing, formatting. It was about that time I discovered that I had the ability to write, too. I never thought I did. I always hated English, flunked English a lot. And so I ended up doing a lot of editing, and formatting, layout, and graphics, and all these things that I really kind of liked to do and was kind of good at, I guess. People tell me I do a real good job of it. And I've been kind of the editor-in-chief for a couple years now of what used to be a little mimeographed sheet. Now it's a 36-page magazine. It's ridiculous. Out of hand. Out of control. But it's fun. I enjoy that. I'm trying to teach Shane Murphy how to do that now and pass a lot of that off, because I think it's dangerous for one person to identify themselves with a cause like GCRG too much, or for other people to identify it, to start to mix one person with an organization, like Dave Brower being the Sierra Club. It was good at the time, but it's probably better for both of them to separate a little, I don't
know. So what about this trip? How did you first hear about it? What was your, first reaction to it? And how and why did you end up rowing a cataract boat on it?
Well, there's another thing, in high school I hated history and never dealt with it in college, but yet I found myself just fascinated with the old stories and the roots of things, and especially in this business. And when I'd get to meet one of these old-timers, I think it's almost in vogue now, but it didn't used to be. People would go, oh yeah, I know this guy. But I more and more got real interested in that and getting involved with you, Lew, and in interviewing some of these guys. Started thinking it was really cool and really pretty important to do that. And I also love boats, any kind of boats. Always been fascinated with the cataract boats, because Canyoneers, who I used to work for, owned a lot of the old cataract boats. They were what became of Mexican Hat expeditions. So I'd always kind of wanted to row a cataract boat. And so I think it was Kenton mentioned to me that they were going to try and run this trip with a whole lot of old-timers, and maybe I should go. And I said, I'm all over it. If it happens, let me know what I can do. I didn't think it would happen at first, because there's always a lot of great ideas, and great things don't happen nearly as often as great ideas do. But as it came closer to happening, and I heard who some of the people on it were, it came to me one day that, hey, we ought to have a cataract boat on that trip. A lot of those people did all their first trips or all their trips in cataract boats. And
I want somebody to be with ML like at 209.
Quarteroli's with him.
I'm not sure that Quarteroli understands yet.
We're rolling. We must have been talking about something. Oh, the cataract boat. Anyhow, I contacted Cam. Asked him if he knew of one, and he thought he did, and he had a boat that I later found out really wasn't his to offer. His mom's boat, the Joan, 1940 vintage. And he thought I could probably row that, so that was pretty exciting. And then I found out that Joan really didn't think that boat needed to go out on a river trip. It's 50-some years old. And she may well be right there. So then I thought about it for a little bit more, and Bob Rigg, who used to row these boats in the 50s and 60s, I had met him at several of our boatmen's meetings, and he had once mentioned to me he had a friend, Jack Treese in Grand Junction, who had a cataract boat that he'd probably loan Bob anytime Bob wanted it. So I called Bob, and he called Jack Treese, and Jack Treese agreed to let him have it for the trip. So Bob flew down to Salt Lake, picked up a car he's got there, drove to Grand Junction, picked up the boat, drove it to Flagstaff a day or two before this trip. It was pretty shredded. It's a fiberglass boat. It's not all wood like the old ones. And so I launched into it in a fury of fiberglass clouds and noise and epoxy, and made it into a boat again and painted it with the old cataract boat paint job, the Conoco green and white with Mexican hat expeditions on the side. And it really made it look like a cataract boat. It didn't look that much like one before. And tried to copy the old paint job. Threw it back on the trailer all wet and gummy with wet paint and launched it, and here we are.
How's it been rowing that boat? How's it been? Have you been digging it, or has it been hard?
I've loved it. I have flat out loved it. It's real different than a dory. I thought it would be. Does some things the same, completely won't do other things. It will not punch a big wave, period. It just, boom, stops, fills up with water, and does something else. Either turns over or washes off to the side. But it won't punch a wave. And maybe the old ones with a full load of gear in them would punch through a little better. I kind of doubt it, though. Bob says this one's hundreds of pounds heavier than the originals, and our gear load is hundreds of pounds lighter, so that about evens out. It's got short, stubby, little heavy oars, mainly because the boat is so narrow, you can't put a long oar on it. And a boat with oars too long is utterly unmanageable. But I love it. I mean, the boat is what they used to row, and the oars belong to Jim Rigg, who's one of the old Mexican hat expeditions and Neville's expedition heroes. Bob's brother, who's died at 12 years ago, I guess, of cancer. But, you know, to row one of those boats with Bob Rigg and with Brother Jim's oars, the drawbacks of it are it's not quite as smooth as a dory, but it's a great boat. And for the time it was invented and the level of knowledge of river running that was prevalent at the time it was designed, it's a phenomenal boat, what it will do. And that thing surfs off the side as sweet as any boat I've ever rowed. You know, when you come up on a wave and you want to slide off to the edge, which is something I like to do, that does it real well. And that pointy little bow behind you can really jam out the side of some laterals and spin off and ride the side of the big waves, which is how they ran them. You know, the gusto down the gut dory run that we love to do is not a cataract boat run. I did it at Hermit anyhow. I couldn't help myself, but
How'd that work? Where were we? I missed
it
that.
worked pretty well. For Granite and Hermit, I was pretty nervous about Granite, and Bob had been swimming that day already and didn't want to swim again, so he filmed. And at the last minute, Roy Webb was standing there and hopped in the back, which stern loaded it. Technically bow loaded it. Ran a little drier, and we didn't get clobbered too bad in Granite. We were able to hit everything we needed to hit pretty well straight on. And then in Hermit, this gale force wind came up just above Hermit. The tops were blowing off all the waves. Looked like the North Seas. And I was going to cheat it like a real cataract boatman, and then I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And we went right down the gut But again, with that back load and a light front, it rode over just about everything. We didn't only got about that much water.
Okay.
But they weren't really breaking back. It's the ones that are breaking back that just kill you in that boat. Like the V-wave in lava.
How was that?
Lava was great. From the first time I went over and talked to Cam and sat in one of those cataract boats, the first thing I did was pretended I had oars and visualized going into lava, and I almost puked. I just went, Jesus Christ, this boat is not built for lava falls. And I tried to run the slot, imagined in my mind that wasn't going to work. I tried to run the right in my mind, that wasn't going to work. I flipped over a few times in my mind and figured where I wanted to be upside down. And until yesterday at 11:20 or whenever we ran it, I had no idea what was going to happen out there. But I don't know, the slot run was there. Kenton and Martin were both pretty excited about running slot. It didn't look right to me. Somehow I just wanted to do the right run. I just felt better about it. I knew what happened there. If you banged it over in the V-wave, you're probably still fine. In the slot, I thought I might get stopped and get sucked back into the ledge or something, and then it wouldn't be that cool. So I'm just not sure how that boat would handle that. Anyhow, I ran right, and Bob Webb really wanted to go, so I took him, and Jerry, my wife, really wanted to go, and she had hiked in there. And she's been in a lot of flips, or enough flips to know that you stay on the top of whatever craft you have, no matter what it looks like. If it's right side up or upside down or broken. So I felt good about that. And off we went down the right. Did the entry, hit the big wave, wallered around straight, and came into the V-wave pretty much dead center. And that's that moment of truth in any boat, and you just kind of, boom, go into it and see what happens. You know. Oh, snake eyes. But okay, made it right on through. Jerry was nearly knocked off somewhere right in there. And she scrambled back on, and we were sideways with the big old stern out there in the slower water and the little bow getting dragged in the fast water, and I tried to straighten it. I probably should have backed on through, but I really wanted to bring it around and move left. And so we hit those bottom waves relatively sideways, but we were full of water and high siding, and came through just fine. It was great. Not a 9.5 in style for the second half, but top was clean. Top was great.
What sticks with you now about this trip? You know, just as far as do you have little memories of some of these people? What are little moments that you've had with them, or little things that you've seen with those guys, with different people, both the old timers and the current crew, that stick out for you now, or that you might remember later on?
I think mostly just getting to meet some of these people and listen to their stories and their perceptions. I haven't paid much attention to the current crew. I mean, we've done the job and got things done, but I've really tried to pay a lot of attention to the old folks and just talk to them. It's hard to say. I mean, some of the stories I've heard, like from Kent Frost and Lois and John Cross Jr., great stories of things that happened to them down here and what it was like for them. And that'll stay with me. And I'm really looking forward to playing with some of the transcripts that are coming out of this oral history project and massaging them into great publishable accounts. And I've been taking a lot of photos, still photos of close-up face shots that I think could be real good to run with those. But it's just been a real honor to have been on the river with these folks and to have been boating with Bob Rigg. And we've had a lot of fun in that cataract boat. and be with Bob in his first flip ever. And his longest swim ever. I think his only swim. He didn't like that swim. It kind of made him shy away a bit from some of the big stuff, but I'm hoping he'll get over that.
Yeah, I've swam there. That is a long old swim.
You've swum sock?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's it like working with Lew?
Jeff. Don't get started. Let's don't get
I
started.
love
on
working
that
with Lew. we both just sort of spin around there and do whatever we think we need to do at the time. And I'm sure both of us are perceived at times as not doing all the camp chores, but I don't know. There's just a lot of stuff that's got to be done, and a lot of it's human relations work. And that's what I feel I do better than some other things. But I love working with Lew. He's got a great laugh. And a frequent one.
This trip has been the focal point of a lot of attention, some positive, some negative. But what are the best reasons? What were the good reasons for doing this trip? And I think we've already kind of touched on that, but I'm just.
Well, I think one of the problems with it is that it was presented as a science trip originally, and scientists like hard data, hard reproducible data, and that's pretty hard to do with old memories. And I think that was one of the biggest binds in the whole thing, and where all the little turf wars got started. But I think it's really worthwhile. I'm not sure how much scientific data is going to come out of it, although Bob has filled in a lot of blanks on his cards. But in terms of getting some of these stories figured out, I think it's been really valuable. You know, where people came from, how it all came about, what it was like then, what it's like now, and just, I guess I like history better than hard raw data. I like stories better than cold facts. So I think it's been really valuable in that sense, in getting a lot of stories together, and the story of Grand Canyon being the main one, of boating down here. And I think it's also been a tremendous gift for these people to be able to do this trip. You know, they are getting more out of it than any of us, I think. Like, you know, Lois did a trip in 38 and a trip in 94. And she wasn't planning one in 94. Bob Rigg has been just aching to get back here since 65. And here he is back here in a cataract boat. It's just a tremendous thing for him. And all these guys. And to meet each other, a lot of them, although they're all old timers, they knew about each other and met each other. They'd never been boating with each other. So I think that's been a real benefit of this trip, is for them to be down here.
What do you think it says for Dave Wegner and the Bureau that they supported this trip?
I think it says a lot for the people who supported it, like Dave Wegner, who is, I could talk for a long time about Dave Wegner. He is a real hero, an incredible politician. I would hate to go up against him on any issue, because I've just watched him. He's incredible. And I'm really glad that he went for this trip, as otherwise it wouldn't have happened. And I think the people that really fought it going were a little short-sighted, or a little turf-oriented. But I don't know the whole story on it. I just, you know how rumors are.
What are we forgetting? There must be something. I get the feeling maybe we should keep this thing moving, but usually every time we do one of these, you shut the thing down and then 15 minutes later you go, God, why didn't we talk about, a short while later you go, wait a minute, here was this one real important thing that we should have covered, in this instance. What can you, wonder what that is with us here. I wonder what ought to be said, in this context.
Where the hell's Brian? As usual.
As usual.
Boy, I don't know. I just hope if they do another one of these that I get invited. That I wasn't perceived as so lame and useless that they don't want me along.
What do you think about the Stanton Photo-match project?
I think it's interesting. I don't think it's the end-all be-all of studies and appreciation of the Grand Canyon. But I think anybody that's involved in one particular science or topic or studies, they almost have to be totally engrossed with it in order to make it happen. And some of those photo matches are pretty neat.
What do you think of... Go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I don't know.
Tell me a little something about Stanton. What do you think Stanton would... what do you think of the fact that his ghost is running around, kind of there are little echoes of his work through this trip? And
Stanton's a pretty interesting character. Real strong personality. He got involved in a lot of things that didn't work out that well, like the river trip. There were deaths on that, which weren't his fault at all. It was the guy in charge, Frank Brown. But even so, the trip, although it did survey a railroad, it was a railroad that really didn't need to be built. There were already a couple of transcontinental railroads. And some of his later fiascos he got involved with. It just says to me that he was a real strong-willed man with a lot of interesting ideas, which might not have been great ones, but he had a lot of tenacity. And the legacy that makes him pretty popular with Bob, I think, is just a phenomenal photographic record that he made. Mostly to show people where his railroad was going to go. But I think probably a bit of a maniac, Robert Brewster Stanton. He had to be. I won't make any present-day analogies, but he was so into what he was doing that he did a really good job, and the benefit to us is something that he never would have guessed would have been useful. In terms of boating, advancing the science of boating, I don't think he got anywhere. And I'm glad that he didn't build his train. And I'm glad that the Glen Canyon didn't really turn into a full-on mine, which it would have if the Hoskanini had done what he had hoped it would do. A very possessed guy.
what about GCES and the task at hand in the future?
That's a tough one. When the GCES was first formed as a phase one of the studies, it seemed like they were just trying to figure out how to make things okay down here. And the question that came out of that was, what's okay? It's an utterly artificial environment now because of the controlled dam and the sediment starvation. And all the exotic species down here and the plant progression and the animal progression that happens under that environment is utterly determined by the operations of the dam. And it's no matter how much you mimic the old environment, you're never even going to come close. And so they're in the position of playing God, where they have to decide what is the right environment, what is the good environment down here. And no matter how much science you do, it's a value judgment. You know, is a bird-rich environment down here with a real viable low river ecosystem like all this stuff we're sitting in, is that right? Is that good? Now, that's not a scientific judgment. That's a value judgment. And is it worth somebody's money to have that happen? You know, the eagles at Nankoweap, is that good? You know, they weren't here before the dams. Is it good or is it bad? The trout fishery, the endangered species who have come in here that thrive on the environment that's being created. The interim flow is creating a whole new environment between 20,000 and 30,000. All of a sudden, boom, there's cottonwoods down here, growing like fury. I think that's fun. I love cottonwood trees. But is that good or is it bad? That's the big question in my mind. And that's the tough one to decide. And no matter how many billions of dollars they spend on studies, the answer to that's not going to come out of science. And I hope it doesn't come out of politics, but it kind of does.
Well, I wonder how do we figure it out? How does it come?
Well, Carruthers says biological diversity is good. He makes this given here. And if you buy that line, then the interim flows are very good because they provide more sediment, more aquatic species can survive in there. The beaches are more hospitable to the plant life, the cottonwoods, everything. There's more biotic diversity with the interim flows if you say biologic diversity is good. But if you look at the pre-dam, there was not that much diversity. There were a few native species in the river, some of which are gone. Almost everything from the river's edge to the high water line was obliterated on a semi-annual basis. Every 5 or 10 years at maximum, it was hosed. And that was Grand Canyon. Big sandy beaches with nothing on them. So I don't know how you go about defining good and bad. If you base it on money, which is the religion of the United States, then it's bad. Biotic diversity is bad because it's expensive. So you can't crank your peaking power at every moment you want it. And if you base it on a biologist's view, then it's good.
On this trip, we've heard, we ask, we kind of come to this question. We come to what changes have people seen? Like, have you noticed a dramatic change down here from the time that you started until now in the corridor, in the environment? And
yeah.
What's changed?
A few real dramatic ones, like 1983, before and after. But more and more, the beaches, a lot of them have gotten hosed out, either by the river flows or by side canyon flash floods, which will rip out a whole beach, which normally would have been replaced within a year or two by a river flood. We've lost a lot that way. One of the big changes, I think, is post-83 with the interim flows. Everything below 70,000 was pretty well rearranged. Some beaches came back, new ones appeared, old ones disappeared, some stayed the same. But now we have this biologic invasion of the interim zone here between 20 and 30. I think it's real dramatic the last couple of years. Getting rid of the huge tidal flows of the pre-interim environment where you'd go from 3 or 5,000 to 30,000 on a daily basis. That was horrible from a philosophical point of view, in that you're trying to run a wilderness river trip with people in a psycho water environment where, you know, you're getting your motor rig parked over there in the morning, you know, 100 feet from the river, or your whole camp gets blown out at night. The interim flows are much more natural. You know, you can present a better wilderness experience, even though it's still utterly man-controlled. I think that's a neat change for the better.
Martin hates the preferred alternative, the modified low fluctuating flow regime. He says a couple things. He says he thinks that the Bureau is sandbagging us. He says right now the water's going from 8 to 12, but and we're kind of being, that's to lull the community into a false sense of security, and that as soon as it's set in stone that it'll be between 20 and 5, he says that's what once that's done, that's what you're going to see happen every day. It's going to go between 20 and 5. And he says the correct flow regime should be a seasonally adjusted steady flow, and that they should move all the peak into Hoover. What do you think about that?
Well, I think he's probably right in a lot of ways, although probably not entirely right. I think seasonally adjusted steady flow is goofy. One constant flow for 3 months is, I don't think, going to be that healthy for the river. Maybe a peaking power, but we just give them one peak a year would be a nicer flow, where it comes up and goes down once a year, but not in one increment at the break of a season, which is what the seasonally adjusted steady
That's
flow
what they
is.
call. Well, Martin says what you do is you run it high in the spring, comes way up, and high in the summer, and then it tapers off in the fall, and then it's real low through the winter.
Right. I think a more tapered flow. I would like to see that personally, but I don't know what the data is to support that. One thing they're finding out is that some fluctuation actually seems to help, keep the beaches clean and bring sand up and leave it there, and bring some more up and leave it there. So I'd like to see the adaptive management maybe push towards that. Again, without solid values that you can define scientifically, it's really hard to get anything done. And Martin wants something that seems natural, and he thinks that would work better. And I don't know if the data supports that. I think he's right in that Hoover could do a lot of the peaking with some expense in transmission lines. But what to do with the releases from Glen Canyon, whether to really mimic the historic flow, which I think would be great from the perspective of river runners trying to be on a quasi-normal stream. I think that'd be great. But I'm not entirely sure what the right thing to do is. And I'm glad Martin's there screaming bloody murder all the time, because he is right in that an awful lot of people have just decided the preferred alternative is the right thing, whereas it's probably not. Another thing that not too many people are looking at is this whole interim flow. When the cap at 20,000 or so, and the once every 5 or 10 or 15 years, it's just a quick flood to throw a little sand up. It's a great idea and preserve this whole new biotic community they've created. But I asked Steve Carruthers, I said, well, Steve, what happens when we get another El Nino cycle and fill the old dam up and have to do an extended spill? Doesn't that pretty much erase everything? He goes, yeah. I said, isn't that going to happen? He goes, yeah. I said, is that being addressed at all? He goes, no. I think we to a large extent, may be wasting our time with that given. We're going to get hosed just as big as we did in '83 again, and it's going to set the clock back to zero.
And so what's the moral of that little story?
I don't know. Try and come up with something that's pretty cool down here that makes as many people happy as we can, I guess, and run it that way. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe Carruthers is wrong, maybe we'll be able to outdo Mother Nature, but I don't think so. I think there'll be a couple of vast, hungry Clearwater floods come through here every so often and really scramble everything that's been done, just like happened in '83. But maybe, if it did survive at '83, here we are, and that was basically a 3.5-year flood, or 2.5-year flood, from June of '83 to the spring of '86. The river was in flood the whole time, and it survived, and it's how we manage it in between there that maybe is what we need to keep looking at. I think any cottonwood forests we get growing down here are going to be ripped right out by a flood like that.